Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss that. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. And if you're in the market for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can always find that over on our Patreon. That is always linked in the description box below. If you're listening on Spotify, you can also find those episodes up at the top of the page in that banner on the screen. We post an additional 3 episodes a month over on Patreon, as well as a monthly live at the end of the month. So definitely check that out if you have not already. But with that being said, let's talk about why we are here today. As you guys can tell by the title of today's episode, today we are talking about the tragic case of Anna Walsh. This is one that definitely became popular with the media and the public when it first took place. If you are active in listening to true crime or keep up with all things true crime, you've probably heard of this case before. And I remember following this case when it had first occurred, and it was one that I always wanted to cover and bring to you guys. And now that there is a trial set in place and there's a trial happening later this year, I thought now would be the perfect time to give you guys an overview of this case so we can keep up with it and we can continue the conversation as the trial comes near. So with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Anna Walsh was born on April 13th, 1983 in Serbia to her mother, Milanka, and her father, whose name has not been made public. Anna's early life was spent in Belgrade, which is where she went to college at the University of Belgrade and obtained a bachelor's degree in French and literature. Anna immigrated to the United States from Serbia in 2005. She was a dual citizen between the US and Serbia, and when she arrived to the US, she immediately got a jump start into her career. She jumped headfirst into her career, and her career specifically revolved around hospitality. Her first job in the US was working as a housekeeping attendant at the inn in Washington, where she would later on become a server as well. But in 2005, things changed for Anna when she met and married her first husband. This was a man named Mark Nip, and the two ended up moving to New York together in 2007 to begin a new chapter in their lives. Once they moved, Anna began working a new job as a program logistics coordinator, and then went on to get hired at the Wheatley Hotel in Lenox, Massachusetts, working as a reservations manager. Now, it was while she was working at this job that the trajectory of Anna's life would change forever when she met a man named Brian Walsh. Now, even though Anna and Brian did not start dating until Anna divorced Mark, Anna said that when she saw Brian, it was immediately love at first sight. Anna and Mark ended up divorcing in 2007, but her and Brian did not begin actually dating until 2014. During that time period between 2007 and 2014, Anna really focused and dedicated herself entirely to elevating her career. She actually ended up getting her master's degree in hospitality from Cornell University, and it was also in 2014 that Anna became the director for a hotel in Boston. And in 2 years later, after 2 years of dating, Anna and Brian finally ended up getting married. After getting married, the two bought a house in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and began the next chapter of their lives. And together, they had 3 sons born in 2016, 2019, and 2020. Now, the 2 things that were most important to Anna in her whole life were her family and her career, primarily her children. As you can tell, Anna was an absolute trailblazer when it came to her job. She was incredibly passionate. She was incredibly hardworking. hardworking. She was incredibly determined, and she truly was an example of living out the American dream. And between the years of 2017 and 2022, she continued working in the hotel industry around Boston while simultaneously devoting her life and time to being a mother as well. Her children were her entire world, and she was an incredible mother to them. She was incredibly involved with everything that they did, and they were her number one priority. Now, in 2022, Anna accepted a new job, and this job was working as a general regional manager at a real estate firm. And for Anna, this meant that she was going to have to split her time between Boston, where her family was living, and DC, where this firm was. So she was going to go back and forth between the two places. And as you can imagine, this was a lot of work for Anna, having to go back and forth, the constant traveling, the being away from her family and her kids. However, she did not slow down. She did it all. She was a working mom and managing all of the hats that she was wearing very well, and not just managing, but excelling in each facet of her life. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding and an idea of Anna, I do want to take a second and talk a little bit about Brian. Now, Brian Walsh, I usually do not give my 2 cents or try and sway you one way or another when talking about our cases or pertaining to anyone in our cases. As you guys know, if you've been listening to me for a while, you would know I like to just present the facts as we know them and allow you to form your own opinions, your own theories. But with Brian Walsh, there's really no arguing this one. This isn't even an opinion that I am giving you. This is a fact. And the fact was that Brian Walsh is and was a con man, point blank. While Anna was out succeeding in her life, in her career, and excelling, Brian was on house arrest. But before the house arrest came into play, Brian was living a life where he craved to be known and he craved to be seen as someone he was not. He put on a very, very large persona. He wanted to be known as this big spender. He would waltz into any restaurant he went to. He would buy the most expensive items on the menu, whether that be a $25,000 bottle of wine or insisting on having an exclusive tasting menu from the chef, whether there was one or not. He would always go above and beyond and try and make people think that he was someone that he wasn't. And then at the end of the day, when the bills would come and when the waiter would put the check on the table, Brian wouldn't be able to pay anything. And instead, he would return the following morning with these large amounts of cash and try and pay everyone off for his troubles. Brian made people believe that he knew a lot more than he did. This isn't to say that Brian wasn't good at manipulating or tricking people. He actually very much was. And even though Brian wanted to be well known and wanted everyone to know him, he simultaneously never let people know who he really was. He wanted to be known, but he didn't want people to know him. Brian's life was a mystery to a lot of his friends. They didn't know how he made his money or what his upbringing was. They knew that Brian claimed to be an art dealer and that he claimed business was going well, but the intricacies of Brian's life were a mystery. For example, a friend of Brian's had met with Brian around the time that Anna's case had occurred, and according to this friend, he could tell that Brian's life was unraveling. During this particular meeting, Brian had confessed to this friend that he was not an art dealer, but an art swindler who was in legal trouble. Brian's friend claimed that Brian told him point blank, quote unquote, "Everything about me is made up." Now let's talk about the house arrest for a second, because you might be wondering how Brian landed himself in that position. Now, Brian pled guilty in 2018 to federal fraud charges, and a part of his pre-sentencing probation was that he was to be placed on house arrest. Now, the reason that Brian was charged with this in the first place is because he was selling fake Andy Warhol paintings. Brian ended up selling fake paintings for $80,000 through a buyer that he found on eBay. And when the purchaser bought the paintings, they realized that these were not real, authentic Andy Warhol paintings, and they were not able to get a refund through Brian. Brian was giving them the runaround. Brian was ghosting them. He wasn't responding to messages, and he was never returning the money. So ultimately, this buyer got the FBI involved, and Brian ended up getting charged for this. So that was in 2018. And from 2018 to 2023, 2023, which is when Anna's case takes place, Brian was on house arrest that entire time. He was never sentenced. Now, as a part of his house arrest, Brian did have to wear a device. However, this was not a GPS device. All this device did was signal to Brian's legal team whenever he left his home. So it would not tell them where Brian was going. And Brian was allowed outside of the home. He just had to get permission first. So if he wanted to go to the grocery store, he would have to ask for permission. If he wanted to go to the convenience store, he would have to ask for permission. He would have to get these things approved. So there were exceptions to his house arrest. Now, in 2019, Brian found himself in trouble with the law again after he was accused of destroying his father's will in order to gain access to his father's assets. Brian and his father, Dr. Thomas Walsh, were completely no contact. They did not speak to each other. Dr. Thomas Walsh was a neurosurgeon, and him and Brian had a very, very turbulent relationship. And it wasn't until Dr. Thomas Walsh died that Brian began to sell off his dad's items to profit off of them. But luckily, Dr. Thomas Walsh's friends stepped in at this point, and they actually filed a motion with the courts against Brian, stating that Brian was profiting off of these items that were not his. And not only that, but that Brian had destroyed Dr. Walsh's will for the simple fact that Brian wanted to obtain all of the assets for himself. Dr. Walsh and Brian had such a rocky relationship that in the will, his father actually pointed out that he was not giving anything to Brian. All he said was that he gave Brian his best wishes. That was it. In the will, it says, "I do not give anything to Brian other than my best wishes, but nothing from my estate." So it was very clear in the will that Brian was not to get anything, which is why it is believed that he destroyed it. So there was no evidence of that. Now, in this motion, it was also revealed that Brian had been previously diagnosed as a sociopath at the Austin Riggs Center and had a history of violence as well. Now, a big strain on the relationship between Brian and his father happened about 10 years prior to Dr. Walsh's passing, when Brian stole over $800,000 from his father. Now, luckily, when the judge read this motion and read through all of the evidence, they ruled that Brian would not receive any of his father's inheritance. So this case really begins on New Year's Eve of 2022, so December 31st of 2022, and Brian and Anna had made plans to celebrate ringing in the new year by staying home at their home in Cohasset, Massachusetts. It was going to be them, their sons, and they also invited a family friend of theirs over to celebrate with them named Jem. Now, Jem said that he arrived to the home at approximately 8:30 p.m. on December 31st, and he left around 1:30 in the morning, so a little bit after midnight. Now, according to him, he said that the night was as normal could be. The three of them, meaning Brian, Anna, and Jem, all celebrated ringing in the new year together. He said that Brian made a delicious, elaborate dinner that they all enjoyed together. Nothing seemed off or out of the ordinary, and like I mentioned, he left at around 1:30 in the morning on January 1st. Now, typically after the new year and coming off of the holiday season, it takes people a day or two to get adjusted back into a routine and normal life. It's always, we see January 1st, January 2nd. It takes people a couple days to get situated back into their routines. And for Anna, she was scheduled to go back to work on January 4th. So she was going to be in DC working on January 4th, and she had a flight scheduled for January 3rd to make it out there for her workday the following day. However, she never showed up for work on January 4th, and this was extremely out of character for Anna. So out of character that her coworkers actually contacted authorities and asked them to conduct a wellness check on Anna at her home in Massachusetts. So that is what they did. When they arrived to the Walsh family home, they knocked on the door, and Brian answered. And police were very shocked to hear from Brian that he had not seen Anna in over 3 days. According to Brian, he stated that Anna was scheduled to fly out to DC on January 3rd. However, she received an emergency call from work that made her leave in the very early morning hours of January 1st. So he's saying that Anna receives this phone call. There's a work emergency. She now has to leave on January 1st, the very early morning hours of the 1st, rather than the 3rd as she had originally planned. He said that he watched as Anna frantically packed her suitcase and left the house at approximately 6 a.m. to go to the airport, and she left via a rideshare service like Uber or Lyft. Now, according to Brian, he said that this was the last time that he saw Anna. He said that after his wife had left, he went back to sleep and got up again at around 7 a.m. to make the boys breakfast before the babysitter came to the house to watch the kids while he went out and ran a few errands. Brian stated that the first stop he made was to a grocery store called Shaw's. He got his groceries, dropped them back off at his house, and then went out to his mom's house to run some errands for his mother. Brian claimed that he had actually lost his phone earlier that morning. He did not know where his phone was. He said he misplaced it. So he was running all of these errands without his phone. Brian also said that it was because he didn't have his phone with him that he ended up getting lost on the way to his mom's house because he wasn't able to use his phone as his GPS. So he didn't have maps telling him where to go, which is what took him an additional 30 minutes to get to his mom's house. Brian said that once he arrived at his mom's home, he stayed there for about 15 minutes before leaving to go to Whole Foods and CVS to pick up things for his mom before dropping those items back off at her home and then going back to his house in Cohasset. Brian said that when he went home, he then found his phone within the couch cushion in the living room. So he then at that point was able to access his phone again. Brian said that the following day on January 2nd, he only left his house once, which was to take one of his sons to a Pressed juice bar store to get something from there, while the other 2 boys stayed home with the babysitter. So this was all of the information that Brian had given authorities. It was the timeline and his sequence of events throughout the days after Anna had left the home. But again, he said that he had not seen or heard from Anna since the early morning hours of January 1st. And so with this information, police immediately file a missing persons report and begin their investigation. One of the first things that they did in this investigation included pinging Anna's cell phone. And when they did that, they saw that on January 1st and January 2nd, Anna's phone pinged in the nearby areas of the Walsh family home. Now, this information completely contradicts Brian's statement when he stated that Anna left the home on the 1st with her phone. If she was going on an airplane, if she was going to DC for work, she was going to bring her phone. He also stated that she used her phone to order a rideshare app, whether that be Uber or Lyft. That had to have been on her phone. But instead, her phone is pinging in and around the house on the 1st and on the 2nd. Now, I do want to mention that to this day, Anna's phone has not been reported to have been found. So that is a piece of evidence that is missing. Up until now, the phone has not been recovered, but we were able to see that before it was turned off in the days after the disappearance, it was at the Walsh family home. Now, Brian and Anna lived in a home that was surrounded by a lot of woodlands and wooded areas. So detectives did very comprehensive searches throughout those wooded areas. They even drained the Walsh family pool. They were asking neighbors if anyone had seen Anna, if anyone had heard of anything. However, no one had. Now, there was one particular incident that people thought was a little bit too coincidental to not be suspicious, was on January 6th of 2023, so just about 5 days after Anna's disappearance. One of the properties that the Walshes owned, one of the properties that Anna and Brian had, it had actually caught on fire, and people were starting to wonder if there was some sort of connection to Anna's disappearance and this house fire. But police were able to do an investigation, and they learned that not only did the Walshes sell that specific property in 2022, but this seemed to be a completely accidental fire and had no connection to Anna's disappearance. Now, 7 days after Anna went missing on January 8th, police were able to determine something that really did change the trajectory trajectory of this entire case. It was a week after the disappearance when police learned that Brian had been untruthful about his whereabouts around the time that Anna went missing. As I had just mentioned, Brian had stated that he went to Whole Foods and CVS to run errands for his mom. However, there was no proof and no evidence of this ever being true. There were no receipts, there were no camera footage, there was no CCTV footage, no parking lot surveillance, absolutely no evidence to prove that Brian was where he said he was during that time frame. But instead, there was proof that Brian had gone to Home Depot in Rockland, Massachusetts on January 2nd and spent $450 on cleaning supplies. So not only is Brian misleading the police with the information that he's giving them and flat out lying, but instead he went to Home Depot, which he did not tell them he did, and bought cleaning supplies. And not just cleaning supplies, but $450 worth of cleaning supplies. So with this, Brian was arrested and charged with misleading the police in the investigation, because not only was he lying to authorities, but remember, Brian was on house arrest. This was completely going against the rules of his house arrest. So because of this, he was arrested and he pled not guilty. But it is important to remember that up until this point, all he was being charged with was misleading the police. Now, Lynn Beelan is the lead prosecutor on this case against Brian, and she tore apart Brian's story from front to back from the very beginning. So let's go through her findings. Brian had originally stated that Anna took an Uber or a Lyft from their house to the airport on the early morning hours of January 1st, but there is no proof of that whatsoever. Every time you take some sort of rideshare service, no matter what it is, there's going to be proof. There's going to be evidence. There's going to be a receipt, whether that's email. There's going to be some sort of log of that ride history. But there was no history of Anna ever taking a rideshare ride on the early morning hours of January 1st. And like I had previously mentioned, what we know is that Anna's phone was pinged at her house on January 1st and January 2nd. So that contradicts the rideshare story as well. And as I had mentioned, the phone has still not been found, and after January 2nd, it was turned off completely. Now, Lynn Beeland also brought up the inconsistency and flat out lies about the Whole Foods and CVS runs. They showed evidence proving that instead, Brian was at Home Depot wearing a black face mask and blue surgical gloves as he was purchasing the cleaning supplies. It was also revealed that after Brian's arrest, there was a search warrant obtained for the Walsh home, and this is when detectives discovered a bloody, bent knife in the basement home. And Brian really had no explanation for this knife. Now, from the defense's point of view, they tried to argue that the only thing that Brian did wrong was not inform his point of contact about him leaving the house because he was on house arrest. The defense claimed that Brian didn't necessarily mislead the police, he just didn't tell them everything. And that was their stance pertaining to the misleading information that Brian was given. But regardless, the judge really just wiped away the defense's argument, and they set Brian's bail to be at $500,000. Now, the same day that Brian was arraigned by the police, detectives actually searched a trash transport facility in Peabody, Massachusetts, where they made a startling and horrifying discovery. After hours of searching with canine units and search teams, they discovered several trash bags, and inside of those trash bags were rugs, used cleaning supplies, torn up clothing, blood, a hatchet, a hacksaw, tape, slippers, a piece of a necklace that belonged to Anna, her boots, and more. So it was confirmed that the discoveries made within these trash bags belonged to the Walshes, and more specifically belonged to Anna. And because of that, the contents inside of them were incredibly unsettling. Because of these findings, on January 17th of 2023, Brian Walsh was officially arrested for the murder of Anna Walsh, and he immediately pled not guilty to all the charges against him, but investigators have been confident that Brian not only murdered Anna, but dismembered her and disposed of her body into different dumpsters. And their confidence in this comes from the evidence that I am about to present to you. After Brian's arrest, the affidavit was unsealed, and there was an overwhelming amount of even more disturbing information and evidence that pointed towards Brian. It was revealed that on January 3rd, Brian's phone shows that he was not at home like he originally stated, but in fact, he was in Brockton and Abington, Massachusetts. Now, these are both about 45 minutes away from Cohasset, where the Walsh family home was. Now, like I said, Brian never disclosed to the authorities that he was in either of these places. And when police looked even further into this and tried to decipher where Brian went, they learned through surveillance videos that Brian had gone to several different apartment complexes and threw very large and heavy trash bags into the dumpsters of these complexes. On the video, it is seen that Brian is actually struggling to get some of these trash bags into the dumpsters. He's having to use all of his strength. He's having to jump to get these trash bags in the dumpsters. And because of that, police are confident that unfortunately, and more than likely, the contents inside of those trash bags were Anna's remains. But sadly, that will never be able to be confirmed because on January 3rd, that same day, those items were taken away by the trash facility. So we will never be able to confirm what exactly was inside of those bags. Now, it was also revealed on January 4th that Brian made a visit to Home Goods and TJ Maxx to purchase towels and bath mats. And he also went to Lowe's to purchase a squeegee. Now, again, Brian never informed police that he was making these trips. He never told them about it, but it was through their own investigation that they were able to uncover Brian's lies and make a trail of what he did in the days following his wife's disappearance. Now, it was on January 4th, like I said, that Anna's coworkers had reported her missing. Brian's attorney claimed that Brian did call Anna's workplace that day and asked if they knew where Anna was because Brian hadn't heard from her. So the defense is trying to say that Brian did care and he did reach out and he was looking for his wife, but he didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone else. He called the workplace and then the coworkers called the police. Now, when the police conducted their wellness check, not only did they speak to Brian, but they also noticed that in the back seat of Brian's car, there was a plastic liner. Their back seats of the car were down and the plastic liner laid flat across the back seats of the car. And police did not have a warrant at that time to search the car, to obtain anything that was inside the car, so they couldn't take the plastic liner. They just saw it and had to leave it there. And when they returned the next day with the warrant, the plastic liner was no longer there and Brian said he threw it away. He also didn't have any explanation as to why he had that in the car, but regardless, police were never able to obtain that either. But what they did notice when they looked inside of the car was vacuum lines in the car, as if Brian had cleaned up the inside of his vehicle. Now, if all of this evidence wasn't damning enough, if you're listening to this and saying, I still don't know, I still am unsure, I'm going to present to you the search history, Brian's Google searches that he made directly after Anna went missing. And these started on the early morning hours of January 1st, 2023. At 4:45 a.m., how long before a body starts to smell? 4:48 a.m., how to stop a body from decomposing. 5:20 a.m., how to bound a body. 5:47 a.m., 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to. 6:25 a.m., how long for someone to be missing to inherit. 6:34 a.m., can you throw away body parts? 9:29 a.m., what does formaldehyde do? 9:34 a.m., how long does DNA last? 9:59 a.m., can identification be made on partial remains? 11:34 a.m., dismemberment and the best way to dispose of a body. 11:44 a.m., how to clean blood from a wooden floor. 11:56 a.m., luminol to detect blood. 1:08 p.m., what happens when you put body parts in ammonia? 1:21 p.m. Is it better to throw crime scene clothes away or wash them? On January 2nd, his searches included 12:45 p.m. Hacksaw, best tool to dismember. 1:10 p.m. Can you be charged with murder without a body? 1:14 p.m. Can you identify a body with broken teeth? January 3rd, 1:02 p.m. What happens to hair on a dead body? 1:13 p.m. What is the rate of decomposition of a body found in a plastic bag? 1:20 p.m. Can baking soda make a body smell good? I don't know how you can read or hear those Google searches and not jump to the conclusion that I think many of us are jumping to, not only with the Google searches, but the mountain of evidence against Brian right now seems very damning that he in fact did potentially and allegedly murder Anna Walsh, his wife. Now, the prosecution and the investigators leading up to this trial have really been trying to piece together what exactly they believe could have happened here and what led to what they believe to be the murder of Anna at the hands of Brian. They were trying to figure out the why here. What could have happened? What led to this? And what they learned when they started doing a little bit of digging is that Anna was allegedly having an affair with a man that she met in DC. Like I had mentioned, Anna was traveling back and forth from Massachusetts to DC for work. And according to this man, because this man has since spoken to authorities, he has confirmed that him and Anna did have a relationship. The name of this man has not been made public yet. I'm sure as we get closer to the trial, it may or may not be, but he has spoken to authorities and he has said that the two of them began to see each other in the months leading up to her disappearance, and that the relationship became more serious within the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He claimed that him and Anna spent Thanksgiving of 2022 together in Ireland. They also spent Christmas Eve together, and they were planning on celebrating New Year's together on January 4th. So they were going to celebrate when she got back to DC. Now, it is believed that in the months leading up to her disappearance, Brian was beginning to catch on with the fact that Anna was seeing someone else because he actually had his mother hire a private investigator in DC to conduct surveillance on Anna. And this specific private investigator specialized in proving infidelity. Now, it is believed that this private investigator was able to confirm this relationship to Brian in December of 2022. And that is potentially where this motive of murder could have lied. Now, Anna also had a $2.7 million life insurance policy that Brian was the sole beneficiary of, and that is just another point of motive here. Anna had an extensive real estate portfolio, and Brian was not listed on any of her properties, but he was the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. Now, some of Anna's closest friends have confirmed that Anna confided with them about the marriage that she had with Brian and the status of the marriage, and she confessed that the marriage with Brian really started to deteriorate after Brian's fraud conviction. I want to make it clear, Anna was never charged in anything connected to the fraud. Her friends have stated that Anna confessed that she was not happy within her marriage and certainly not happy with Brian. And after the fraud charges, that really was the breaking point for her. And that is when she began to slowly make plans to move her and her 3 boys to DC permanently. However, unfortunately, we know now that that did not get to happen. So where do we stand on this case now? Let's talk about that for a moment, because the trial for Brian Walsh is set to take place this year, and it is set to begin on October 20th of 2025. Now, earlier this year in January, Brian's attorney named Larry Tipton did file a motion to object how the forensics lab was going to be testing 6 different DNA samples. Now, these samples were samples that the prosecution was sending to a lab called Bode Technology, and these samples included blood, tissue, muscle, and possible bone fragments. So the prosecution chose Bode Technology to basically analyze these 6 samples. And Bode Technology is a company that's based in Virginia, and they specialize in DNA analysis and other forensic services. Now, the issue that the defense was having with Bode Technology was that they wanted an expert observer from their side, of their choosing, to watch as Bode Technology conducted their analysis, because they were worried that something was going to go wrong. They were going to tarnish these samples, and it would make them impossible to conduct their own testing. So the defense wanted the prosecution to do their testing at Bode Technology if that's what they wanted, but they wanted an expert witness of their choosing to watch that analysis happen. That way they then could take those samples and then go do their own secondary testing of those samples. Now, the reason that this became a problem is because Bode Technology has restrictions on what the expert observer will be allowed to see and watch. It's just a part of their basic protocol. Certain parts of the testing process can only be viewed through a video feed at certain camera angles, and the expert observer will not be able to move that specific camera. And the defense is arguing that this is a violation of Brian's rights. They claim that they would rather just use the state crime labs rather than Bode Technology, and they don't understand the reasoning for having to use Bode Technology. But the judge has denied this motion and has allowed the prosecution to go ahead and have Bode Technology analyze those 6 samples. So that is really where we stand so far in this case leading up to the trial. Again, like I mentioned, this is going to be one that we continue to watch, continue to talk about. I'm sure that during the trial, there is going to be a lot more information that comes out, a lot more evidence that comes forward. I'm sure there's going to be many, many witness statements. I know in particular, I would be interested to hear regarding this case about the babysitter who came on January 1st. I think it would be very telling to hear from her perspective and her point of view what she remembers the sequence of events looking like on January 1st when she arrived that morning. I'm sure more information about the details of Anna and Brian's relationship will come more to light throughout the trial. I'm sure we will have answers to certain questions, but then again, a lot more just questions in general, because at the end of the day, this is a tragedy. Anna's life was cut way too short. This did not need to happen, and the fact that it did is absolutely devastating. No matter how you want to look at this, this is an absolute tragedy. But I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about this. What do you think about the trial that's coming up? What do you think about the evidence that's going to be presented? What do you think about Brian? What do you think about all of it? Let me know in the comments below. And with that being said, you guys, that's going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Before you leave, make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here every single Wednesday on the podcast. You're not going to want to miss it. And the video version on YouTube as well. Make sure you check out the Patreon if you have not already. Like I mentioned, that is always linked in the description box below. But with that being said, I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.